I'm in here with you.
Imagine this. You're in your home, your sanctuary, surrounded by the familiar comfort of your own four walls. You lock your doors at night, believing you are safe, believing you are alone. But what if you're not? What if, in the hidden spaces you never knew existed, the crawl spaces, the attics, the forgotten voids behind the plaster, someone else is there? Listening, watching, breathing the same air as you. Today, we are going to share 6 true, terrifying stories of phrogging, of people who discovered they were sharing their home with a secret, silent, and very real roommate. It is one of the most violating fears imaginable. The horror is not in a ghost story. It's in a terrifying reality. It's the gut-wrenching realization that the scratching sound you dismissed as rats was a person. That the food disappearing from your pantry wasn't your own phrogetfullness. It is the absolute destruction of your sense of security. The knowledge that while you slept, ate, and lived your private life, a stranger was just inches away on the other side of the wall, silently observing your every move. But how is this possible? And how would you even know? By exploring these real, chilling accounts. From a faint cough inside a living room wall to an eye staring back from an air vent, we will uncover the terrifying methods these intruders use to remain hidden and the subtle signs that you are not truly alone in your own house. These stories are more than just tales of horror. They are a lesson in paranoia, a guide to the secrets that your own walls might be keeping. Now, before we listen to the walls, make sure you are subscribed to Whispered Fear and have activated the bell. You don't want to be the only one who doesn't hear them coming.
We're neighbors.
Our first story is about the sounds a house makes. The groans of settling wood, the hiss of old radiators, the skittering of mice in the attic. These are the familiar, explainable noises we learn to live with. But this story comes from a young family who learned that sometimes the sounds are not the house. They are its secret inhabitants. It's a story about a scratching sound that wasn't a pest, and the terrifying human truth that was hiding just inches away on the other side of the living room wall. For David and Sarah, the house was a victory. It was a narrow, 3-story row house in Fishtown, Philadelphia, a neighborhood in the midst of a turbulent rebirth. Old working-class grit was being sandblasted away to make room for shiny new condos and artisanal coffee shops. Their house on East Cumberland Street was a relic of the old world. It was a fixer-upper, bought at a price that had stretched their finances to the absolute breaking point. David, a high school history teacher, and Sarah, a part-time graphic designer, had poured their life savings and a mountain of hope into this brick and plaster dream. It was their first home, the place where their 2-year-old son, Leo, would grow up. The house wasn't just an investment. It was their entire future. They knew it would be work. The floors slanted, the windows were drafty, and every wall was a topographical map of cracks and imperfections. But it was theirs. For the first few months, their life was a chaotic but happy blur of paint fumes, takeout pizza eaten on a dusty floor, and the sound of Leo's laughter echoing in the empty rooms. They were building a home, a life, from the bones of a forgotten past. The scratching started in the fall. It was a faint sound coming from the main wall of their living room, the one that connected their house to the identical, but derelict and abandoned row house next door. It was a dry, skittering sound. David had said with the weary confidence of a new homeowner. Rats. Welcome to city living. It was a logical, almost comforting explanation. A pest was a problem with a solution. You go to the local Lowe's on Aramingo Avenue, you buy some traps, you solve the problem. So that's what he did. He set a half-dozen traps in the dark, musty basement that ran the length of both houses. For a few days, the scratching stopped. David declared victory, but then it returned. This time, it was different. It was slower, heavier, less like the frantic scurrying of a rodent and more like the sound of a single, thick nail being dragged slowly across a wooden lath. It would start and stop at hours, mostly in the dead of night, a slow, methodical scrape, 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 that seemed to gnaw at the edges of their peace. The traps in the basement remained empty. David, frustrated, bought more. He set them in the attic, a dark, stifling space under the eaves. Still, nothing. He began to feel a sense of unease. The sound was too rhythmic, too intentional. It seemed to respond to them. If they were watching television, the scratching would be steady. If they got up to investigate, it would stop, plunging the room into a sudden, listening silence. It was Sarah who first noticed the other things. A smell. A faint, unpleasant odor, like old, damp clothes and stale sweat, that would appear in the living room for an hour or so, and then vanish. Then, there was Leo, their son, who was just starting to string words together, began to interact with the wall. He would stand in front of it, his head tilted, and have long, one-sided conversations. He would hold up his favorite blue dinosaur toy to the plaster and say, "See?" Roar. One afternoon, Sarah found him sitting by the wall, pushing small pieces of his graham cracker into a tiny crack in the baseboard. She asked, "What are you doing, sweetie?" Leo replied, his voice full of a child's simple logic, giving a snack to the wall man. A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. The wall man? "He's hungry," Leo said, pushing another piece of cracker into the wall. That night, they put the story together for David. He was skeptical, but worried. He's a 2-year-old, Sarah. He has a big imagination, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. The empty traps, the strange smell, their son's bizarre behavior. The logical explanations were beginning to wear thin. The next day, David called an exterminator, a local company called Philly Pest Control. A tired-looking man named Frank came out, did a thorough inspection of the basement, the attic, the exterior. His conclusion was baffling. He said, wiping his hands on a rag, "Folks, I've been doing this for 25 years. You got no rats, no squirrels, no raccoons. Your foundation is sealed tight. I can't find a single sign of pest entry." He pointed to the wall. "Whatever noise you're hearing, it ain't an animal I've ever met." The exterminator's verdict was a turning point. It removed the last comforting layer of rational explanation. If it wasn't a pest, what was it? The house settling? The pipes? But pipes don't sound like a nail being dragged across wood, and houses don't have conversations with a 2-year-old boy. The ambiguity was a form of psychological torture. The source of their fear was a sound, a smell, a feeling. There was nothing to fight, nothing to see. Just the slow, creeping certainty that they were not alone in their own home. The scratching continued, a nightly torment. They started sleeping in the guest room at the front of the house, as far from the living room wall as possible. Their dream home had become a place of anxiety. Their evenings spent listening, waiting for the sound to start. They were prisoners of a single shared wall. The climax came on a cold, rainy Sunday night. The family was huddled together on the sofa, watching a movie, trying to create a small bubble of normalcy in their sea of anxiety. The scratching started, louder than ever before, a frantic, desperate sound. David, his patience finally snapping, leaped from the sofa. He yelled, "I've had enough of this." He walked to the wall and banged his fist on it with all his might. He roared, his voice echoing in the small room. "Be quiet." The scratching stopped instantly. The sudden, absolute silence was deafening. David, Sarah, and even little Leo, who had started to cry, all froze. They stood there in the quiet, listening, waiting. And then, from the other side of the wall, they heard it. It was not the sound of scratching. It was a voice, a sound so faint, so fragile, it was almost swallowed by the sound of the rain outside. It was a dry, weak, rattling sound. It was the sound of a human cough. The sound hung in the air for a moment, a small, pathetic, and undeniably human sound. And then, silence. David and Sarah just stared at each other, their faces masks of pure, undiluted horror. The sound had been inches away. A person. There was a person living inside their wall. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Every strange event of the past few months clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The scratching, the smell, the wall man. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was a person. A real, living person. The police arrived 20 minutes later. Their presence both a comfort and a terrifying confirmation of the nightmare they were in. David explained the situation, his voice trembling, feeling the insanity of the words as he spoke them. The officers, 2 veteran Philly cops, exchanged a look, not of disbelief, but of a weary, grim understanding. They had seen this before. The abandoned row house next door was owned by the city, slated for demolition, but trapped in a bureaucratic limbo. The officers used a heavy-duty bolt cutter to snap the rusted padlock on the front door. The door opened into a scene of utter dereliction. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. They moved through the dark, empty rooms, their flashlight beams cutting through the gloom. In the back of the house, in what used to be a small pantry, they found it. A section of the wall that connected to David and Sarah's living room had been crudely torn open. Behind it was a small, dark, impossibly cramped space. It was a forgotten, walled-off utility chase, a vertical shaft that ran between the 2 houses, no more than 3 feet wide. And inside, huddled on a pile of filthy rags and old newspapers, was a man. He was emaciated, his clothes in tatters, his face covered in a thick, matted beard. He was a homeless man who, years ago, had discovered this forgotten space, this tiny, vertical slice of shelter, and had made it his own. He would sneak out at night through the abandoned house to forage for food, and then return to his hidden sanctuary. The scratching sounds had been him, moving in his cramped space, his nails or a small piece of metal scraping against the old wooden laths behind David's drywall. The smell was him. The wall man was him. He had been their secret roommate, their silent, unseen neighbor, living a desperate, parallel life just inches away. The man, whose name they learned was Arthur, offered no resistance. He was confused, frightened, and clearly mentally unwell. He was taken away by the paramedics. A quiet, tragic ghost brought out into the harsh, unforgiving light. David and Sarah stood in their living room, the house now filled with police officers and a profound, echoing silence. The wall, their wall, was no longer just a wall. It was a membrane, a thin, fragile barrier that had separated their safe, happy life from a world of desperate, unimaginable suffering. They sold the house 6 months later at a loss. They couldn't stay. The sanctuary had been violated in the most profound way possible. They moved to a new, modern apartment building in Center City, a place with thin, new walls that held no secrets, but the fear lingers. Sometimes, late at night, Sarah will put her ear to the wall that separates their apartment from their neighbors. She listened, not for scratching, but for the sound of breathing, the sound of a cough, the faint, human sounds of another life, just on the other side. And she is left with a question that haunts her to this day. How well do you really know your own home? And how thin are the walls that separate your world from the desperate, silent, and hidden lives of the people all around you?
I was hungry.
Our next story is about the quiet gaslighting that can happen in the solitude of one's own home. It's about the slow, creeping doubt that begins to erode your sanity when your own memory becomes an unreliable narrator. It comes from a woman named Evelyn, a baker who learned that the hunger in her house was not her own, and that the greatest violation is not what is taken from you, but the discovery of the silent, secret life that has been living alongside yours all along. Evelyn was a woman who found solace in precision. At 58 years old, she was recently widowed, a new and unwelcome chapter in a life that had otherwise been a study in comfortable routine. Her husband, Mark, had been the loud, chaotic, wonderful center of her universe. His sudden passing from a heart attack 6 months prior had left a silence in their small Savannah, Georgia home that was louder than any noise. To combat the grief, Evelyn had poured herself into her passion, baking. She ran a small, artisanal bakery from her home kitchen, Evelyn's Enduring Sweets, supplying pastries to a few local coffee shops like the Paris Market on Broughton Street. Her life was now a quiet symphony of flour, sugar, and the warm, comforting scent of baking bread. The house, a historic 1920s craftsman bungalow in the quiet, leafy Ardsley Park neighborhood, was her sanctuary and her workplace, a fortress against the lonely world outside. The pantry was the heart of her operation. It was a large, walk-in space off the kitchen, meticulously organized with floor-to-ceiling shelves, sacks of King Arthur flour, jars of spices, bags of chocolate chips, cans of pumpkin puree. Every item had its place. Evelyn knew her inventory by heart. She was a woman who noticed when a single vanilla bean was out of place. The first discrepancy was small, easily dismissed. A new, unopened bag of walnuts she had bought for a batch of biscotti was missing. She searched every shelf, her frustration mounting. She muttered to herself, a common refrain in her new solitary life, "I must be losing my mind." She assumed she'd simply forgotten that she'd already used it, a casualty of a grieving, overworked mind. She bought another bag and thought no more of it. A week later, it was a can of condensed milk. She knew, with absolute certainty, she had 3 cans on the second shelf. Now there were 2. Again, she chided herself. "You're not as young as you used to be, Ev. Your memory is playing tricks on you." It was a sad, logical explanation. But the phantom attrition continued. A box of raisins, a jar of strawberry jam, small, non-essential items, always things that could be explained away by her own supposed forgetfulness. It was a slow, insidious erosion of her own confidence. She began to feel like a ghost in her own home, her actions becoming untethered from her memory. She started leaving notes for herself. Little post, it's on the pantry door. Bought 3 cans of corn, October 12th. But even then, a can would disappear, and she would be left staring at her own handwriting, a tangible piece of proof that contradicted the empty space on her shelf. The self-doubt began to curdle into a low-grade, constant paranoia. She started to suspect her neighbors, a group of college students from the Savannah College of Art and Design who lived in the rental next door. Maybe one of them, in a drunken prank, had an old key. The thought was absurd, but it was more comforting than the alternative, that she was losing her mind. She spent $100. She couldn't really afford to have a locksmith from Cawthron Security come out and rekey all her doors. Locksmith, a kind, elderly man, assured her the new locks were unpickable. The house was secure. The next morning, a brand new jar of expensive imported apricot preserves was gone. That was the turning point. This wasn't her memory. This wasn't a prank. This was something else. A quiet, persistent, and utterly baffling invasion of her sanctuary. The fear was no longer a vague unease. It was a cold, hard presence in her life. She did what any rational person in the digital age would do. She went to the Best Buy in the Oglethorpe Mall and bought a security camera. She chose a small, discreet Wisecam, a little white cube that she could hide among the jars on a high shelf in her pantry. It was motion activated and would send a notification directly to her phone. If it detected any movement, she was taking back control. She was going to catch her ghost. She set up the camera, its small black lens a silent technological witness. For 3 nights, there was nothing. The pantry remained still. The notifications on her phone were silent. She began to feel foolish again, a paranoid old woman inventing mysteries. She almost took the camera down. On the 4th night, just after 2 a.m., her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a sharp, jarring sound in the quiet bedroom. She fumbled for her glasses, her heart pounding. The screen was lit up with a notification from the Wise app. Motion detected. In pantry, her breath caught in her throat. She tapped the notification, her hand trembling. The app opened to a live black and white night vision feed of her pantry. The room was still. The shelves were exactly as she had left them. There was no one there. A false alarm? A mouse, maybe? But the motion sensor was calibrated for larger objects. She was about to dismiss it when she noticed the small icon indicating a new recording had been saved. The motion had triggered a 1-minute video clip. She took a deep breath, her finger hovering over the play button. She was about to see the truth. She pressed play. The video showed the silent, motionless pantry. For the first 20 seconds, nothing happened. Then, on the far wall, behind the main shelving unit, a section of the wall seemed to shimmer. It wasn't a door. It was a panel, a section of the beadboard wall that she had always assumed was just a part of the house's structure. But it was moving. A thin, vertical line of black appeared as the hidden panel swung inward, opening into an abyss of absolute darkness. A moment later, a figure emerged. It was a man. He was painfully thin, his clothes ragged and dirty. He moved with a practiced, silent grace, a creature of the shadows. He moved into the pantry, his eyes, which glowed a faint, ghostly white in the infrared light, scanning the shelves. He moved with a quiet confidence, a familiarity. This was not his first time here. He knew his way around her pantry better than she did. She watched, paralyzed with a fear so profound it was almost sublime, as the man took a box of crackers from a shelf. He opened it, his movements slow and deliberate, and began to eat, standing there in the dark, a silent thief in the heart of her home. He took a jar of peanut butter, unscrewed the lid, and ate directly from the jar with his fingers. He was not a rushed, frantic burglar. He was a resident, having a late-night snack. After a few minutes, he carefully replaced the half-eaten items on the shelf, screwed the lid back on the peanut butter, and turned to leave. He slipped back through the hidden panel. The panel swung shut behind him. This seemed so perfect it was. Once again invisible, he was gone. The video ended. Evelyn was left staring at the frozen image of her own pristine pantry. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She just sat there in her bed, her mind a shattered landscape of terror and disbelief. The locks on her doors, the security of her neighborhood, the very walls of her home. It had all been an illusion. She had been living in a cage with a wild animal, a secret, silent roommate who came and went as he pleased. The wall man from the previous story had been a tragic ghost. This was a real, living, breathing threat. Her first instinct was to call the police. But what would she show them? A video of a man in her pantry. A man who had emerged from a wall that to any normal inspection did not have a door. And a man who, most importantly, was now gone? They would search the house, find nothing, and leave her alone again in the place she now knew was not safe. No, she needed to know more. She needed to understand the geography of her own nightmare. She spent the next day in a state of hypervigilant terror. Every creak of the house was him. Every shadow was him. She kept the pantry door closed, afraid of what she might see if she opened it. She waited until the next night, after she was sure he would be gone. Out on his nightly foraging, she put her plan into action. Armed with a crowbar and a heavy flashlight, she went to the pantry. She stood before the shelving unit, her heart pounding. She pulled the unit away from the wall. The beadboard wall behind it looked perfectly normal. She ran her hands over it, searching for a seam, a latch, anything, and she found it. A tiny, almost invisible indentation near the floor. She pressed it. With a soft, sickening click, the hidden panel swung open, revealing the dark, musty space behind it. A wave of cold air, smelling of damp earth, mildew, and unwashed bodies, washed over her. She shone her flashlight into the opening. It was not a room. It was a narrow, dirt-floored crawlspace, a forgotten void that ran between the walls of her house and the house next door. And in this space, he had made a home. There was a filthy sleeping bag, a pile of empty food containers, her food containers, and a small stack of old water-stained books. But there was something else. Pinned to the dirt wall with a rusty nail was a collage of photographs. They were old, faded, black and white photos of a family, a man, a woman, and a small boy, standing in front of her house, smiling, and in every photo, the small boy was holding a single, perfect red apple. And then she saw the fresh pile of apple cores on the dirt floor beneath the photos. A new wave of understanding, more terrifying than the last, washed over her. She knew the history of her house. She had researched it at the Savannah Historical Society before she bought it. The original owner, a man named Silas, had built it in the 1920s. He had lost his wife and his young son, a boy named Thomas, to the Spanish flu pandemic. The records said Silas had gone mad with grief, that he had sealed off his son's room and had eventually been taken to an asylum where he died. The man in her walls, he wasn't just a random squatter. He believed he was Thomas. He was a man, lost to time and his own broken mind, who had found his way back to his childhood home and was now living as a ghost in its forgotten spaces. A perpetual little boy waiting for a family that would never return. She backed out of the crawlspace, her mind reeling. This wasn't a simple case of breaking and entering. This was a tragedy, a haunting of a different kind. She was about to call the police to finally end it when she heard a sound from the kitchen, a soft, scraping sound. The sound of the hidden panel in the pantry being opened from the inside. He was back. He had come home early. She didn't have time to run. She just had time to hide. She ducked back into the pantry and squeezed herself into the small gap between the wall and the shelving unit, pulling a large sack of flour in front of her. She held her breath, her body rigid, listening. She heard him move through the pantry, his footsteps soft and practiced. She heard the clink of a jar, the rustle of a bag. Then he went silent. The silence stretched for an eternity. She risked a peek around the edge of the flour sack. He was standing in the middle of the pantry, his back to her, but he wasn't eating. He was just standing there, his head cocked, as if listening. He knew. He knew something was different. He could sense her presence. He turned slowly, and his glowing infrared-white eyes from the security footage seemed to bore directly into her hiding place. He took a slow, deliberate step towards her, then another. She knew, in that final, terrifying moment, that her greatest fear had been wrong. She had been afraid of the intruder in her walls. She had been afraid of his secret, his hunger, his madness. She had never stopped to consider the most terrifying possibility of all, that after all this time living in the dark, what he was most hungry for was company.
Don't make a sound.
Our next story is about the hidden geography of our own homes. The dark, Forgotten spaces that exist just beneath our feet. Spaces we rarely think about, but that are an integral part of the structure we call a sanctuary. It comes from a man named Frank, a cable technician on the verge of retirement, a man who had seen the inside of 1,000 homes. He learned, on one final routine service call, that sometimes the most terrifying discoveries are not made by the homeowners, but by the strangers they invite inside. He learned that one family's perfect suburban dream was another man's silent, watchful kingdom. Frank had been a technician for Spectrum for 35 years. He was 62. His knees ached, and he was counting the days until his retirement. A future that promised endless fishing trips on Lake Ray Hubbard and time with his grandkids. His best world was one of coaxial cables, signal splitters, and the quiet, professional intrusion into other people's lives. He was a ghost in the machine of suburban connectivity. He'd seen it all. Hoarders' nests, pristine minimalist mansions, the chaotic, joyful mess of young families. He had a practiced, calming demeanor, a gentle giant of a man who could put even the most anxious customer at ease. He was good at his job because he was thorough, and because he understood that when you entered someone's home, you were entering their life. His last call of the day was a simple one. A new installation in Plano, Texas, a sprawling, affluent suburb north of Dallas. The address was on a quiet, tree-lined street called Winding Way, in a neighborhood of large, modern two-story brick houses with perfectly manicured lawns. It was the picture of suburban safety and prosperity. He pulled his van up to the curb in front of the Henderson house. It was a beautiful home, a recent build with a large oak tree in the front yard and a child's bicycle lying on its side in the driveway. He was greeted at the door by Mrs. Henderson, a warm, friendly woman in her late 30s. Inside, the house was immaculate. It smelled of linen polish and fresh laundry. Two young children, a boy and a girl, were playing quietly on a soft gray rug in the living room. Their laughter a gentle, happy sound. It was the kind of home Frank recognized instantly. A well-managed, loving fortress against the chaos of the outside world. Mrs. Henderson explained, her voice a mix of apology and frustration. The internet connection in the upstairs office is just terrible. We had a technician out last week, but he couldn't figure it out. He said the signal was getting lost somewhere in the walls. Frank nodded, his professional mind already cycling through the possibilities. No problem, ma'am. I'll just need to check the main junction box, likely in your crawlspace, and then trace the line up to the office. Shouldn't take too long. The crawlspace was, as it always was, the least pleasant part of the job. The access hatch was in a closet at the back of the garage. Frank put on his dusty coveralls, his knee pads, and his headlamp, the familiar ritual a comfort. He opened the hatch, and the smell of damp earth and cool, stagnant air washed over him. He clipped his tool, belt to his side, and began his descent into the darkness. The crawlspace was tight, maybe 3 feet high. The ground was packed, red Texas clay. The space was a labyrinth of support pillars, plumbing pipes, and electrical conduits. It was dark, silent, and forgotten. Frank moved on his hands and knees, his headlamp cutting a sharp, white circle in the oppressive blackness. He found the main cable junction box easily, mounted on a concrete support near the center of the house. The wiring was a mess, a sloppy job by the previous technician. He sighed. Amateurs. He got to work, his movements practiced and efficient. He replaced a faulty splitter, tightened the connections. The silence of the crawlspace was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the soft click of his tools. From far above, he could occasionally hear the faint, muffled thud of the children's feet running on the floor above, a ghostly reminder of the warm, happy life that existed just a few feet over his head. After about 20 minutes, he had fixed the connection. He just needed to run a new, dedicated line up to the office. A simple but tedious task that would require him to navigate to the far corner of the house. He began to crawl, his tool belt scraping against the dirt, the beam of his headlamp dancing in front of him. It was in the far corner, directly beneath the master bedroom, that he found the first anomaly. His hand, pressing down on the dirt for leverage, touched something that wasn't dirt. It was soft fabric. He angled his headlamp down. It was a sleeping bag. A dirty, well-used green sleeping bag, neatly rolled and tucked away in the space between two support pillars. Frank froze. His mind, a logical, problem-solving mind of a technician, struggled to process the data. A sleeping bag? Down here? His first thought was that it was old, forgotten, left behind by the construction crew when the house was built. But it wasn't covered in a thick layer of dust. It was relatively clean, as if it had been used recently. A cold, unfamiliar feeling began to creep up his spine. He scanned the area with his headlamp. A few feet from the sleeping bag, he saw them, a neat small stack of empty food cans, canned beans, tuna fish, Vienna sausages, and next to them, a dozen empty plastic water bottles. Someone was sleeping here. Someone was living here, in the dark, silent space beneath the Henderson family's feet. The silence of the crawl space was no longer peaceful, it was menacing. It was the silence of a hidden presence, a secret inhabitant. Frank's heart began to beat a slow, heavy drum. He was a large man, not easily frightened. But this was a different kind of fear. The fear of a violation so profound, so intimate, it was almost unthinkable. He knew he should leave. His job was done. The signal was fixed. He should just crawl back to the hatch, pack up his tools, and go. He should tell the homeowners what he had found. But a morbid, terrifying curiosity held him in place. Who was this person? How were they getting in? What were they doing down here? He crawled a little closer to the makeshift living space, his movements now slow and silent, his breathing shallow. He saw a small stack of books, their covers warped by the damp. He saw a small battery-powered lantern. It was a nest, a human nest, and then his headlamp beam fell upon the photographs. They were pinned to the soft, insulated lining of the floor joist directly above the sleeping bag, like posters in a teenager's bedroom. They were Polaroid photos, dozens of them. And they were all of the Henderson family. They were photos of the children, sleeping peacefully in their beds, their faces angelic in the dim light. They were photos of Mrs. Henderson, asleep on the couch in the living room, a book resting on her chest. They were photos of Mr. Henderson, at his desk in the home office, his head in his hands, clearly exhausted. They were photos taken from an impossible perspective, from a low angle, looking up. From inside the house, from the air vents. Frank felt the air leave his lungs in a silent, horrified rush. The person living down here wasn't just hiding. They were a predator, a silent, patient, and methodical observer. They had been crawling through the hidden spaces of the house, through the ductwork, using the air vents as windows into the most private, vulnerable moments of this family's life. He stared at the photos, his mind a maelstrom of terror. The smiling, friendly woman who had let him into her home. The laughing, innocent children. They had no idea. They were living their perfect, happy lives, completely unaware of the secret. Watchful eyes that were studying them from the darkness beneath their feet. He had to get out. He had to warn them. He began to back away, his movements clumsy now, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He turned, his body too large for the cramped space, and started crawling as fast as he could back towards the access hatch. The sound of his own frantic scrabbling seemed deafening in the silence. He was halfway back when he heard it, a sound from the direction of the access hatch, a soft, scraping sound. The sound of the hatch cover being slowly, quietly slid back into place from above. He froze, every muscle in his body locked. He turned off his headlamp, plunging the crawlspace into absolute, total blackness. He lay there in the dirt, his heart a wild bird trapped in his chest, and listened. He heard the soft thud of the hatch cover settling into place. He heard the metallic click of a lock being engaged. And then he heard footsteps, the soft, shuffling footsteps of someone walking away, back into the garage, into the house. He was trapped in the dark, silent earth beneath the house, with the chilling knowledge of what he had found. And a new, more terrifying thought began to form in his mind. The person who had just locked him in, was it the homeowner? Mr. Henderson, coming home from work and unknowingly sealing the crawlspace? Or was it the man who lived down here, who had returned to his nest to find an intruder and had decided to seal him in with his terrible secret? He didn't know which possibility was more terrifying. He lay in the suffocating darkness for what felt like an eternity, his mind a looping nightmare of the photos, of the sleeping children, of the silent, watching eyes. He finally fumbled for his phone, his hands slick with sweat. He had a weak signal, one bar. He dialed 911, his voice a frantic, choked whisper. The police arrived, their presence a loud, jarring intrusion into the quiet suburban street. They freed him from the crawlspace. His body stiff and covered in dirt. He told them what he had found. The two Plano police officers listened. There, faces grim, they entered the house and spoke to a bewildered and terrified Mrs. Henderson, who had been in the backyard with the children and had heard nothing. They searched the crawlspace. The nest was there, just as he had described. The sleeping bag, the food cans, the books, but the photographs were gone. The police found the point of entry. It was an old, forgotten cistern access point at the back of the property, hidden under a dense, overgrown azalea bush. The heavy iron cover had been pried open. This was how he had been getting in and out. This was his secret door. The man was never identified. He was never caught. He had simply vanished, a ghost who had melted back into the anonymous landscape of the city, leaving behind only the cold, hard evidence of his secret parasitic life. Frank retired a week later. He couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't enter another stranger's home, couldn't crawl into another dark, silent space without the memory of what he had found under the Henderson house. The image of the photographs of the sleeping children was a permanent scar on his mind. He's haunted by the knowledge that the walls we build to keep ourselves safe are full of holes, full of hidden pathways and forgotten spaces. And he is haunted by the final, chilling question that he can never answer. The photos he saw were Polaroids, instant film. They had to have been developed somewhere. He had seen them pinned to the insulation, but he never got a close look at the camera the intruder must have used. And he wonders, to this day, where the man got the photos printed. Or if, in that dark, silent space beneath the floor, in that makeshift kingdom of filth and quiet observation, the man had also built himself a small, functional darkroom.
I can see you.
Our next story is about the thin barrier of plaster and trust that separates a child's bedroom from the unknown. It's about the parental instinct to dismiss a child's fantasy and the horrifying consequences of being wrong. It comes from a father named Mike, an engineer who believed in logic and reason, who learned that the most terrifying monster is a real one, and that the only thing worse than finding it is realizing it's been watching your family from the darkness inside your own walls. Mike and Jessica had finally done it. They had escaped the cramped, overpriced rental market of Raleigh and bought their first home. It was a modest, two-story house in a quiet, family-friendly subdivision in Cary, North Carolina, a place consistently ranked as one of the safest towns in America. The house on High House Road wasn't new, a product of the late 90s building boom, but it had good bones, a decent yard, and was in the district for a great elementary school. For Mike, a structural engineer, and Jessica, a stay-at-home mom, it was the perfect, logical next step for their 5-year-old daughter, Emily Dodd. It was their fortress of normalcy, a safe, beige-colored container for their future. Emily's room was the first they set up Dodd. It was painted a soft lavender. Her menagerie of stuffed animals arranged on a new bookshelf, a unicorn nightlight casting a gentle, magical glow. Dodd, it was a perfect child's room, a sanctuary within there. Sanctuary. Mike had checked the entire house himself. The foundation, the wiring, the attic insulation. He was a man who understood how things were put together. He knew the house was solid. He was confident it was safe. The vent monster appeared about a month after they moved in. Emily was not a fearful child. She announced the presence of the monster with a simple, matter-of-fact curiosity. She said one evening, as he was tucking her into bed, "Daddy, there's a monster in my vent." Mike smiled, the weary, indulgent smile of a parent. "Oh yeah, what kind of monster?" she said, her eyes serious. "A quiet one. He just watches me from the holes." She pointed to the rectangular, white air conditioning vent on the wall near the ceiling. "He's shy," Mike said, kissing her forehead. "Well, you tell him that this is your room and he needs to be a polite monster." He dismissed it instantly. It was a classic childhood fantasy, a way for her to process the strange new sounds and shadows of an unfamiliar house. It was normal. It was healthy. The vent monster, who Emily later nicknamed Mr. Whispers, became a regular part of their nightly routine. She would have one-sided conversations with the vent, telling him about her day at kindergarten. Jessica found it adorable. Mike found it a little strange, but harmless. He would hear her whisper into the vent, "No, Mr. Whispers, you can't have my cookie. Mommy says no snacks before bed." The first crack in their comfortable dismissal of the fantasy came a few weeks later. Jessica was in the kitchen, talking on the phone with her sister in Charlotte, complaining about a leaky faucet she had just discovered under the sink. Emily was in her room, supposedly napping. A few minutes later, Emily padded into the kitchen, her face full of a child's solemn importance. She walked over to her mother and tugged on her shirt. She whispered, "Mommy, Mr. Whispers said to tell you there's a big puddle under the sink, and you should put a bucket there so the floor doesn't get wrinkly." Jessica froze, the phone still pressed to her ear. She hadn't said a word about the leak to Emily. There was no way her daughter could have known. She ended the call quickly and knelt down to look at her daughter. "How did you know about the puddle?" "Sweetie," Emily just pointed towards the ceiling. "Mr. Whispers told me. He can hear everything." When Mike got home from his office at the engineering firm Kimley-Horn that evening, Jessica told him about the incident. He was quiet for a long time, a frown creasing his brow. He said finally, more to himself than to her, "The vents, the ductwork connects the whole house. She must have overheard you through the return vent in the hallway. It was a logical, plausible explanation. It had to be. But for the first time, the idea of the vent monster felt less like a fantasy and more like an invasion of privacy. The unsettling incidents began to accumulate, small, explainable anomalies that, when taken together, began to paint a terrifying picture. One night, Emily mentioned that Mr. Whispers was sad because he had lost his shiny circle. The next day, while cleaning behind the heavy dryer in the laundry room, which shared a wall with Emily's room, Jessica found an old silver dollar from 1922. Another time, Emily refused to play in her room. Her lower lip was trembling. Mr. Whispers is sick. Today, he's making a scratchy noise. That night, Mike was woken by a faint, rhythmic scratching sound. It seemed to be coming from the attic, directly above Emily's bedroom. The next morning, he went up to the attic to investigate. He found a squirrel's nest in the corner and a small dead squirrel that had apparently gotten trapped. He removed the nest, sealed the entry point, and felt a wave of relief. It was just an animal. The scratching, the sickness, it all had a rational explanation. But he couldn't explain how Emily, sleeping in her room one floor below, could have known about a dead squirrel in the attic. The house, their fortress, began to feel less secure. The quiet moments were now filled with a low-grade hum of anxiety. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the AC became a potential signal, a message from the unseen world within there. Mike, the man of logic and reason, found himself standing in the hallway at night, just listening. He was starting to believe his daughter, and he was terrified. He decided he had to prove it, one way or the other. He had to debunk this fear, for his own sanity and for the peace of his family. He needed to show Emily and himself that there was nothing in the vent. The final, horrifying confirmation came on a Saturday night. Emily had woken up from a nightmare, crying. When Jessica went in to comfort her, Emily was pointing at the vent, her small body trembling. She sobbed. "He's mad, Mommy. Mr. Whispers is mad." His eyes red. After they had calmed her down and gotten her back to sleep, Mike knew he couldn't wait any longer. He went to the garage and got his big, heavy-duty Maglite flashlight, the kind that could cut through the darkest night. He went back to Emily's room. The unicorn nightlight cast a soft, peaceful glow. He stood on a chair, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He whispered to himself, a desperate mantra. It's just a vent. It's just a vent. He took his screwdriver and carefully, quietly, removed the 2 screws holding the white metal vent cover in place. He pulled the cover away, revealing the dark, rectangular maw of the ductwork. A blast of cold, musty air, smelling faintly of dust and something else, something vaguely organic and unpleasant, washed over him. He took a deep breath, aimed the powerful flashlight beam into the opening, and looked inside. The beam cut a sharp, white circle through the darkness. He could see the interior of the metal duct. It was just as he expected. A straight, silver-colored tube, about 10 inches in diameter, running horizontally into the wall. It was dusty, filled with cobwebs. There was nothing there. A profound wave of relief, so powerful it almost made him laugh, washed over him. He had been a fool. It was all just a child's fantasy, amplified by the stress of a new house and his own parental anxiety. He was about to put the cover back on and finally put the matter to rest. But he decided to do one last thorough check. He angled the flashlight beam upwards, towards the top of the duct, and then down. And then he aimed it as far back as he could, to where the duct made a 90-degree turn upwards, presumably towards the main trunk line in the attic. The beam hit the back of the elbow joint, and he saw it. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a shadow. It was something small and wet and terrifyingly real. For a split second, at the very edge of the flashlight's beam, peering around the corner of the metal duct from the darkness beyond, was an eye. A single human eye. It was wide, bloodshot, and reflected the flashlight beam with a wet, sickening gleam. It was not the eye of an animal. It was an eye filled with a raw, intelligent, and undeniable terror. It stared back at him for a single, heart-stopping second. And then it was gone. It retracted back into the darkness of the vertical shaft with a soft, fleshy sound. Mike didn't move. He couldn't. He just stood there on the chair, his flashlight beam still pointed at the empty corner of the duct, his mind a white-hot scream of pure, undiluted horror. Emily's red eye. It hadn't been a monster. It had been a bloodshot, terrified human eye, staring down at his sleeping child from the darkness within the walls. The world seemed to tilt and fall away. He stumbled off the chair, the heavy flashlight clattering to the floor. He ran out of the room, slamming the door behind him, and stood in the hallway, his back pressed against the wall, gasping for air. He woke Jessica, his voice a frantic, strangled whisper. He didn't have to convince her. The look of absolute terror on his face was all the proof she needed. She grabbed the sleeping Emily from her bed, wrapping her in a blanket while Mike called 911. The Cary Police Department arrived with a quiet, professional efficiency that felt surreal. Mike told them the story, the words tumbling out in a chaotic, barely coherent stream. The eye in the vent, the dead squirrel, the leaky faucet. To his eternal gratitude, they didn't treat him like he was crazy. They listened. 2 officers went up to the attic. And in the dark, dusty space directly above Emily's bedroom, hidden beneath a thick layer of blown-in insulation, they found him. He was not a monster. He was a man, or rather a boy, a teenager, no older than 16, painfully thin, and catatonically terrified. He was huddled in a small, makeshift nest he had created in the space between the roof joists. It was a space filled with empty food wrappers, water bottles, and a small, tragic collection of stolen treasures from the house. One of Jessica's missing earrings, one of Mike's old neckties, and a small blue plastic dinosaur that belonged to Emily. The story, pieced together later, was a quiet tragedy of the modern world. The boy was a runaway from a broken home in a nearby town. He had discovered, through some forgotten access panel on the roof, that the space between the attic floor and the second floor ceiling of this particular model of house was a network of hollow, interconnected voids. He had been living in their house, in the spaces they never knew existed, for months, even before they had moved in. He was a silent, desperate ghost, surviving on the food he could steal from their pantry at night, and finding his only human connection in the quiet, one-sided conversations he had through the vents with a little girl who thought he was a monster. He had been watching them, listening to their entire lives unfold through the ductwork of their home. He knew their schedules, their arguments, their secrets. The eye in the vent had been his. He had been peering down at Emily, and when Mike's flashlight beam had hit him, he had recoiled in terror, his own fear a mirror image of Mike's. He was taken away, a quiet, broken child swallowed by the system, but he left a permanent ghost behind in the house on High House Road. Mike and Jessica sold the house. 6 months later, they couldn't stay. The sanctuary had been violated from the inside out. Every vent, every quiet corner, every shadow was now tainted with the memory of the silent, watching eyes. They now live in a new, modern apartment, a place with thin walls and no hidden spaces. But Mike is haunted by a question that keeps him awake at night. He thinks about the boy, hidden in the insulation, listening. He thinks about the day he fixed the squirrel problem, the day he sealed the only other entry point to the attic, and he is left with a single, chilling thought that he has never shared with his wife. On the night he looked into the vent, he hadn't just found the boy. He had trapped him.
I'm still here.
Our next story is about the ghosts we think we've exorcised, the ghosts of past. Relationships. It comes from a young woman named Jenna, who learned that sometimes when you ask someone to leave your house, they don't actually go, they just find a new place to hide. She discovered that the familiar sounds of her ex-boyfriend weren't just memories playing tricks on her mind. They were real, and he had been her silent, secret roommate all along, watching her from the darkness just above her head. Jenna's freedom was a fragile new thing. At 26, she had just ended a 3-year relationship with a man named Alex. On the surface, Alex had been perfect, charming, intelligent, successful, but underneath, he was a man made of quiet control. His love was a cage, padded with soft words but built with bars of steel. He didn't like her friends. He questioned her work as a freelance illustrator. He had a key to her apartment, a beautiful but slightly crumbling second-floor unit in a historic single house in Charleston. South Carolina. The apartment on Trad Street, with its narrow rooms and high ceilings, had once been their shared sanctuary. In the final months of their relationship, it had begun to feel like his outpost in her life. The breakup was the hardest thing she had ever done. It was quiet, civil, and utterly soul-crushing. He had finally agreed to leave, packing his things with a slow, deliberate sadness that felt more like a threat than a concession. The last thing he did was place his key on the kitchen counter. His voice was soft. "I'll always be looking out for you, Jenna." She didn't understand the chillingly literal meaning of those words until it was far too late. The first few weeks after he left were a revelation. The silence in the apartment was no longer oppressive. It was liberating. She could play her music as loud as she wanted. She could leave her canvases and paint tubes scattered across the living room floor. She could breathe. For the first time in years, the house felt like it was truly hers. But a 3-year relationship doesn't just vanish. It leaves echoes. Ghosts. It started with the sounds. She would be sitting at her drafting table, the quiet hum of her computer the only sound, and she would hear it. The specific 3-note that Alex always made when he was deep in thought. She would freeze, her pencil hovering over the paper, her heart giving a painful lurch. Then she would shake her head, a sad smile touching her lips. She would tell herself, it's just a memory, a phantom limb of a relationship. Then she started hearing his footsteps. He had a specific, heavy-footed gait, a slight drag in his left foot that she could recognize anywhere. She would be in the kitchen and hear that familiar thump scrape, coming from the bedroom down the hall. Her rational mind knew it was the upstairs neighbor, a quiet elderly man who worked at the College of Charleston. But her grieving heart, for a split second, would believe it was Alex home from work. These were the explainable ghosts, the tricks of a mind rewiring itself after trauma. She accepted them as a part of the healing process. But then came the sounds that were not so easy to explain. One night, she was woken from a deep sleep by a sound that made her sit bolt upright in bed. It was the sound of the attic hatch. The hatch was in the ceiling of the hallway, a simple, square piece of wood with a folding ladder. She had never opened it. The landlord had told her the attic was just a dusty, unusable crawlspace. The sound was unmistakable, the soft scrape of the hatch being pushed aside, followed by the metallic clink of the aluminum ladder unfolding. She sat in the dark, her body rigid with fear, listening. She heard a single, soft footstep on the hallway floor. Then, silence. A profound, listening silence that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. She stayed like that for an hour, not daring to move, her ears straining for any other sound. Nothing. Finally, she convinced herself she had dreamed it. It was a vivid, terrifying dream, but just a dream. The next morning, she checked the attic hatch. It was closed, flush with the ceiling, exactly as it should be. There was no sign it had been disturbed. But the incident left a crack in her fragile sense of security. The house no longer felt entirely her own. The normal creaks and groans of the old building now sounded like movement, like a secret presence. A week later, something else happened. She came home from a trip to the Harris Teeter on East Bay Street to find a single red rose lying on her pillow. It was fresh, its petals still cool to the touch. Alex had always left her a single red rose. After they had a fight. It was his signature apology. She backed out of the bedroom, a wave of nausea and fear washing over her. He had been here. He had been in her house. In her bedroom. He still had a key. She called him, her voice a furious, trembling accusation. He was calm, collected, and utterly convincing. He was in Atlanta for a business conference. He had been there for 3 days. He had flight records, hotel receipts to prove it. He'd said, a note of genuine hurt in his voice, "Jenna, I promise you, it wasn't me. I gave you my key. I would never do that to you." She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him, but the rose was real. She threw it in the trash, but the image of it, lying on her pillow, was burned into her mind. The gaslighting, she would later realize, was not coming from him, that it was coming from the house itself. The incidents grew more frequent and more personal. Her favorite perfume, a scent Alex had always complimented her on, would be missing from her vanity, only to reappear a day later. A book she was reading would be moved from her nightstand to the kitchen counter, a silent commentary on her habits. They were small, intimate violations, things she couldn't prove, things that made her feel like she was slowly, methodically being driven insane. She changed the locks. She stopped telling her friends about the strange occurrences. She saw the looks of pity and concern in their eyes, the unspoken suggestion that she was not over the breakup, that she was projecting her emotional turmoil onto her environment. She was alone with her fear, a fear that was beginning to feel like a constant low-grade fever. She began to document everything, a desperate attempt to create an objective record of her own fracturing reality. She would take pictures of her rooms before she left for the day, comparing them when she returned. Sometimes there would be a tiny, almost imperceptible difference. A picture frame slightly askew, a throw pillow on the couch moved a few inches. The changes were so small, so insignificant, that she felt crazy for even noticing them. But they were there. The house was being subtly, constantly rearranged by an invisible hand. The final terrifying discovery was an accident. It was a hot, humid Saturday in June. The air conditioning in her old apartment building, a system that was temperamental on the best of days, had finally given up. The air in her apartment was thick, heavy, and suffocating. Unable to work, she decided to do what she had been putting off for months: investigate the attic. She reasoned that a lack of proper insulation might be contributing to the heat. It was a logical, practical task, a way to reclaim some sense of control over her increasingly chaotic home. She pulled the cord for the folding ladder. It creaked down from the ceiling with a groan. She climbed up, her head emerging into a wall of oppressive, stagnant heat. The attic was exactly as the landlord had described: a low-ceilinged, dark, and dusty space, crisscrossed with wooden beams, and insulated with old, yellowed fiberglass. There was nothing up there but dust, cobwebs, and a few forgotten boxes from previous tenants. She shone her flashlight beam across the space, and that's when she saw it. Tucked away in the far corner, behind a massive brick chimney stack, was a space that was different. The insulation had been pushed aside, cleared away to create a small, deliberate clearing. A cold, sick feeling washed over her. She crawled across the rough wooden beams, her knees scraping on the splintered wood. She shone her light into the clearing, and her world fell apart. It was a nest, a human nest, a dirty, flattened sleeping bag lay on the bare wood. Next to it was a small pile of empty plastic water bottles and the wrappers of granola bars and beef jerky. And in the center of this small, squalid living space was a small, battery-powered camping lantern. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it was what was pinned to the brick of the chimney stack. It was a timeline, a meticulously crafted, obsessive shrine to her. There were photographs, dozens of them, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from a hidden location, showing her walking down the street, sitting in a coffee shop, talking to friends. There were receipts he had fished from her trash, a schedule of her work deadlines, downloaded from her shared calendar, and there were pages torn from his own journal, filled with his neat, controlled handwriting, documenting her every move, her every mood. One entry read, "She seemed sad today. She misses me. She just doesn't know it yet." Another, "She changed the locks." A futile gesture. A house has more than one door. And then she saw the final, most terrifying piece of the shrine. Drilled through a small hole in the floorboards of the attic, pointing directly down into her bedroom below, was a small fiber optic. camera lens no bigger than the head of a pin. He had been watching her sleep. He had been listening to her conversations. He had been here the whole time. He had never left. The quiet civil breakup had been a lie. The sad, reluctant departure had been a performance. He had packed a few boxes to sell the illusion, but he had moved the rest of his life, his real life, into the dark, secret space. Above her head, the sound she had heard, his hum, his footsteps, they weren't ghosts of a memory. They were the real sounds of her secret roommate, moving through his hidden kingdom. The rose on her pillow, the moved objects, they were his. Quiet, possessive reminders that he was still there, that this was still his house, that she was still his. She scrambled back from the nest, a raw, guttural scream tearing from her throat. She stumbled down the attic ladder, not bothering to fold it up, and ran. She ran out of the apartment, out of the building, and into the bright, suffocating heat of the Charleston afternoon. The police, when they arrived, found the nest, just as she had described. They found the journals, the photos, the camera. They found everything except for him. Alex was gone. He had a go-bag packed, and when he had heard her scream, he had slipped out through a hidden access panel that led to the roof of the adjacent building, a secret escape route he had prepared long ago. He is still out there. Warrant is out for his arrest, but he is a ghost in the system, a man who knows how to disappear. Jenna is no longer in Charleston. She lives in a new city, in a new apartment, a modern, characterless high-rise with no attic, no crawl spaces, no hidden history. But she is a prisoner of what she found. She has cameras in every room. She checks her locks 12 times a night. She lives with the constant, gnawing fear that he will find her again. She is haunted by his final words to her. "I'll always be looking out for you." She knows now that it wasn't a promise, it was a threat. And she knows that the most terrifying monster is the one that convinces you it's a ghost. The one that makes you believe you are going insane, because it is the only way you can continue to live and to watch from the quiet, hidden spaces of your own home.
It's so quiet in here.
Our final story is about the ghosts that aren't ghosts at all, It's about the secrets that are not buried in the ground, but sealed behind plaster and forgotten for generations, It comes from a young couple, Liam and Chloe, who learned that when you tear down the walls of the past, you don't always find solid foundations. Sometimes you find a diary, and sometimes the diary tells you that you are not the first family to live in the house. You are simply the latest family to be watched. Liam and Chloe were betting everything on a ghost. Not a literal one, but the ghost of a neighborhood's former glory. They had bought a dilapidated, 3-story brick row house in the historic Federal Hill neighborhood of Baltimore, Maryland. It was a classic fixer-upper, a narrow, elegant building on East West Street that had been vacant for the better part of a decade. From the rooftop deck they planned to build, you could see the glittering skyline of the inner harbor. But inside, the house was a wreck, peeling paint, water-stained ceilings, and a silence thick with the dust of forgotten lives. For Liam, a carpenter who worked for a high-end renovation company, the house's brokenness was a language he understood. For Chloe, an elementary school teacher pregnant with their first child, the house was a blank canvas, a vessel for the future of their family. They had poured every dollar of their savings and a terrifying amount of credit card debt into this dream. They were on a strict timeline, 9 months to turn this derelict shell into a safe, warm home before their son was born. Their life became a symphony of controlled demolition. Weekends were a blur of dust masks, sledgehammers, and the satisfying crunch of old plaster giving way. They were a team. Liam, with his quiet competence, would handle the heavy structural work. Chloe, with her artist's eye, would plan the layouts, the colors, the feel of their future home. They were exhausted, constantly covered in a fine layer of white dust. But they were happy. They were building their life beam by beam. The first whispers were easy to dismiss. They started when Liam began tearing out the old horsehair plaster walls on the second floor, the floor that would become their master bedroom and the nursery. Amidst the crash of the sledgehammer and the floor that would become their master bedroom and the nursery. Amidst the crash of the sledgehammer and the nursery. Amidst the crash of the sledgehammer and the Nes. Grating sound of the pry bar, Chloe would sometimes hear it, a faint, muffled sound from deep within the walls of the adjacent, still untouched rooms. It sounded like voices, hushed, indistinct, like a conversation being had in a neighboring house. She asked Liam one afternoon, pausing with a paint roller in her hand, "Did you hear that?" Liam stopped hammering, his face beaded with sweat. "Hear what?" "All I hear is my own tinnitus." The house was a row house, attached on both sides. The walls were thin. Of course, they would hear their neighbors. It was the most logical explanation in the world. The only problem was they didn't have any. The house on the left was a vacant rental property, and the one on the right was owned by an elderly woman who spent the entire winter in Florida. Both adjoining houses were empty. Chloe tried to accept Liam's logic. It was an old house. Sound traveled in strange ways. It was probably just the wind, or sounds carrying from the street, but the whispers persisted, always too faint to make out the words, always seeming to come from just on the other side of whatever wall she was near. Then came the cold spots. There was a specific wall in the room that was destined to be the nursery, the wall that separated it from the master bedroom. It was always cold to the touch, not just cool, but a deep, penetrating cold, as if it were an exterior wall in the middle of winter. Liam, ever the pragmatist, investigated. He used his thermal camera from work. The screen showed a large, dark blue, rectangular spot on the wall, a clear thermal anomaly. He'd muttered, tapping the wall, "That's bizarre." It was solid. There must be a massive gap in the old insulation back there. A thermal bridge. Once we tear this wall down and re-insulate, it'll be fine. He had a logical, structural explanation for everything, but he couldn't explain the feeling that Chloe got whenever she was near that wall. A feeling of profound, inexplicable sadness. A heavy, oppressive sorrow that seemed to radiate from the cold plaster. They decided that this cold, sad wall would be the next to go. It was a non-load-bearing interior wall. Tearing it down would open up the space, creating a small, open alcove between the nursery and their bedroom. A perfect spot for a reading nook. The demolition began on a Saturday. Liam took the first swing with the sledgehammer. The old plaster shattered, revealing the dark wooden lath beneath. He worked for an hour, pulling down plaster and lath, the room filling with a century of dust. He was working his way from the top down. As he cleared a section near the ceiling, he saw something that made him pause. The space between the studs was packed with old, dark, crumbly insulation, as expected. But in one spot, the insulation had been pushed aside, hollowed out, creating a small, dark cavity. He called out, "Hey, Chloe, come look at this." Chloe, her pregnant belly a gentle curve under her dusty t-shirt, came to the doorway. Liam shone his work light into the opening, and they saw it. Tucked away deep inside the insulation was a small leather-bound book. It was a diary. It was old, the leather cracked and dry, the pages yellowed and brittle. Liam reached into the wall, his fingers brushing against the scratchy insulation, and carefully pulled it out. They sat on the dusty floor of their future nursery, a sense of reverence and trepidation washing over them. They were holding a secret, a piece of the house's soul. He opened the cover. The first page had a name, written in an elegant, looping but faded script, Eleanor Vance, and date, 1923. The diary was nearly a century old. The first several pages were filled with the mundane, hopeful entries of a young woman who had just moved into this very house with her new husband. She wrote about the neighborhood, about her dreams for the future, about the child she was expecting. Chloe placed a hand on her own belly, a silent kinship with the woman from the past. But as they turned the pages, the tone of the diary began to change. The hopeful entries gave way to something darker, more frightened. An entry from 1924 read, "He's not the man I thought he was. His temper is a storm that comes without warning. Today he was angry about the cost of the groceries. He threw a plate against the wall. The sound was like a gunshot in this quiet house. I am so afraid, not for myself, but for the baby." Liam and Chloe looked at each other, their own quiet, happy dreams for this house suddenly feeling fragile, tainted. They were reading a story of domestic terror that had played out in the very rooms they were now trying to make their own. They continued to read, the story growing darker with every page. The diary chronicled a life of quiet, hidden fear. Eleanor's husband was a monster, a man of silent, unpredictable rages. And the house, her sanctuary, had become her prison. She wrote of being locked in a room, of the sound of his heavy footsteps in the hall. And then they came to the entries that made their blood run cold. He has started building. He spends all his time on the second floor, in the room that was supposed to be the nursery. He brings in wood and plaster and nails. He won't tell me what he is doing. He just says he is fixing a problem. When I go near the room, he becomes enraged. There is a new wall. A wall that wasn't there before. Liam stared at the wall he had just been demolishing. The wall between the nursery and their future bedroom. The wall that Eleanor's husband had built. The final entries were a descent into absolute terror. I know what he is doing. He's building a room. A small hidden room. A quiet place. He told me it is for when I am being hysterical. He says it is a place where no one will be able to hear me scream. I am so afraid. He has taken my books, my pens. I have one pencil left. I am hiding this diary in the insulation dot. It is the only part of me that will be left. If someone finds this, know that I did not leave. I did not run away. I am in the walls. The last entry was a single, shaky, scrawled sentence. He's coming. The wall is finished. Goodbye. And that was it. The rest of the pages were blank. Liam and Chloe sat in the dust and debris of their dream nursery, in the oppressive, heavy silence. The cold spot on the wall. The whispers. It hadn't been the wind. It hadn't been the neighbor's. It had been her. Eleanor. The echo of her terror. Her desperate final messages, trapped in the very plaster and wood around them. The story should have ended there. A historical tragedy. A ghost story with a real human explanation. But it didn't. Liam, his face a grim, pale mask, stood up. He walked back to the hole he had made in the wall. His voice was a hoarse whisper. There's no room. It's just insulation between the studs. He must have sealed it up completely. But as he spoke, he saw something else, tucked even deeper into the insulation. Behind where the diary had been was another object. It was a modern, plastic Ziploc bag. Inside was another notebook. A simple, spiral-bound notebook, the kind you would buy at a CVS. It was not 100 years old. It was new. He reached in and pulled it out, a sense of profound, reality-bending dread washing over him. He opened it. The handwriting was not the elegant cursive of a woman from the 1920s. It was a messy, modern scroll. The first entry was dated just 6 months ago, a week before they had bought the house. It read, "New ones are coming. A man and a woman. He is a builder. She is pregnant. They will tear down the walls. They will find Eleanor. And then they will find me." Liam flipped through the pages, his hands shaking. The diary was a meticulous, obsessive log of their own lives, seen from the inside. The man Liam, he is strong. He works hard. He does not see me. The woman Chloe, she is more attuned. She can feel the cold. She can hear the whispers. She is afraid. I like her. The baby is a boy. I heard them talking. They are going to name him Noah. It is a good, strong name. He will be safe in this house. I will watch over him. The entries documented their renovation, their conversations, their arguments, their most intimate moments. All with a chilling, detached accuracy. This was not a ghost. This was a person who had found Eleanor's diary, a person who had found her hidden room, a person who had taken up her mantle, her post, her quiet, watchful existence within the walls. He had been here the whole time, watching them, listening to them, living a secret, parasitic life just inches from their own. Liam reached the final entry. It was dated that very morning. The builder is getting closer. He's at the wall now. The cold wall. He has his hammer. He's going to let me out. He's going to let me out. He's going to let me out. And then we can all be a family. Together. Forever. A floorboard creaked loudly in the hallway, just outside the nursery door. Liam and Chloe froze, their eyes locking in a shared, silent scream. The sound hadn't come from upstairs or from next door. It had come from right outside the room. He was out. He was in the house with them. The doorknob to the nursery began to turn slowly with a quiet metallic click. The story of the whispers in the insulation wasn't about a ghost who was trapped. It was about a monster who had just been set free. A man who was a memory. A woman who was a ghost in her own home. Child living in the silence between floors. And a secret that was waiting to be set free. These stories peel back the drywall of our perceived reality and expose the terrifying truth that our homes are not as solid or as empty as we believe. The most profound horror is the violation of the sanctuary. It's the realization that the sounds you dismiss as the house settling are the movements of a secret roommate. It's the knowledge that your privacy is an illusion, that you are being observed from the hidden spaces that exist just inches from where you sleep, eat, and live your life. These are not tales of the supernatural. They are terrifyingly real stories of phrogging, a horror born not from ghosts, but from desperation, madness, and a profound, chilling disregard for the boundaries of a stranger's life. They leave us with a question that will echo in the quiet moments of our own homes. The next time you hear a strange sound, a scratch, a whisper, will you dismiss it as the wind? Or will you finally have the courage to ask who is living on the other side of your wall? If these stories have made you listen to the silence in your own home a little differently, prove you're not just an echo by subscribing to Whispered. Fear, leaving a like, and sharing this video. Your support helps us tear down the walls and expose the secrets hidden behind them. But what if the intruder isn't in your walls, but in your mind? What if the greatest threat is the stranger who knows you better than you know yourself? Click the video on your screen now for our next case file. 5 true horror stories of encounters with someone who knew your deepest secret. See you there, if you have nothing to hide.